As a ferry pilot, it has never ceased to amaze me the condition of some of the airplanes that people ask me to take on what is usually the longest trip that airplane has flown in recent memory, if not its entire service life. I've seen the usual flat tires, foreign objects in the fuel, exceptionally high fuel consumption with and without fuel leaks, excessive oil consumption to the point that you are stopping for oil before fuel despite the fuel leaks, misrigged flight controls, landing gear that won't extend, important switches that don't work, switches that do work, but you spend the entire ferry trying to figure out what they do because they aren't labeled, ammeters wired backwards so that a discharging battery shows a charge, and vice versa, and of course the inevitable fact that when an aircraft battery hears a ferry pilot approaching, it has a 50-50 chance of spontaneously draining itself completely, leaving many an owner baffled with one of the most common lines a ferry pilot can hear, which is, "I don't know what happened, I swear it was completely charged up yesterday." But through all of the sketchy aircraft I've seen throughout the years, there's one that stands out as easily the most sketchy airplane I've ever ferried, and that's the Super Bear. If you have never heard of a Super Bear, don't worry, you're not alone. I hadn't either, but from my understanding, there are only a handful of them built, and they're basically just an experimental Super Cub with stretched fuselage and an IO360 engine, among other small changes. In any case, it was early on in my ferry pilot career, and I was eager to get the next gig when I saw the sad airplane stranded on the ramp of my local airport with obvious signs of neglect and damage. After asking around a bit to get the full story, I discovered that the Super Bear was being ferried to its new home by some new, non-commercially rated pilots when it was ground looped in my airport. During the ground loop, the left side of the airplane dug into the ground, smashing the left wingtip and bending the left horizontal stabilizer. Besides the obvious damage from the ground loop, the rest of the aircraft didn't appear to be in great shape either. The main offender was the type and condition of the paint. And as I've said before, I'm the last person that should be ridiculing an airplane for its paint, but the Super Bear was particularly bad. It had been painted with a thick layer of latex paint that laid like rubber over the entire aircraft. The rubber-like paint was shriveling on the top surface of the wings, making it look like the airplane had been painted with an old man's scrotum. It was also very obvious that the airplane had been sitting out in the elements for quite some time, and the crappy silicone caulk job on the landing light was a telltale sign that the elements weren't the only thing helping to degrade the sad airplane. Perhaps it was the fact that the Super Bear sat there in its state of neglect mainly because of the carelessness of two, quote, ferry pilots, or something else entirely, I'm not entirely sure, but something about that airplane just inspired me to take on the challenge of getting it back flying again. Because of its sketchy condition, no upstanding mechanic had the time nor desire to risk their license with their name in the logbook. So I called up the owner and agreed to head up the task of repairing the Super Bear, as well as test flying it and eventually delivering it to him in Texas. And on that note, I tore into the Super Bear, inspecting anything and everything. First was inspecting the damage from the ground loop. I uncovered the bent left elevator half that had dug into the ground and found that the chromoly tubing underneath was completely compromised. In fact, the corrosion on the brake implied that the elevator may have been cracked even before the recent ground loop, but I'm not entirely certain. Next, I removed the smashed left fiberglass droop tip, noting that although it was heavily cracked, it retained its shape pretty well. It was what I found underneath the fiberglass that was actually the main issue. Apparently, during its years outside in the elements, water had found its way past the silicone caulking, sealing the fiberglass tip to its plywood end cap. The years of trapped water rotted the plywood end cap at the very aft trailing edge to the point that when it impacted during the ground loop, it completely disintegrated. There were several other issues I found as well, such as the large crack in the tailwheel assembly, rusted and broken tailwheel spring hardware, and the fact that somebody had replaced the fuel drain with one that was the wrong size, meaning that any time you wanted to latch the door in its up position, it caused it to leak fuel out of the drain. I solved that with a bit of safety wire, but the little issues like that started to add up. Another interesting thing that I found that I was astonished to find was completely overlooked by both the pilots and the accident report is the fact that there was a complete lack of fluid in the left brake. This meant that there would have been a complete lack of pressure in the left brake, and it's entirely possible that the pilot could have saved the crappy landing and subsequent ground loop to the right had they been able to use the left brake, but I'm not entirely sure, and I guess it doesn't really matter at this point. With a thorough inspection complete, I got a reputable friend who was machinist in trade and an aircraft builder in practice to help fabricate a repair on the elevator, complete with a new fabric covering and a balance before it was installed back on the Super Bear. Soon, it was ready for test flights. As a reminder, this was not only a sketchy-looking airplane that had just been repaired after an incident, it would also be a first flight solo for me in an airplane I'd never flown before. This also came at a time when I was pretty early on in my ferry career, so to say that I was slightly nervous may have been an understatement. During the taxi test, I discovered another part of the Super Bear that I personally think contributed to the previous ground loop. The Super Bear stands tall on its relatively long landing gear and large tires, which, when coupled with the seating position, limits forward visibility considerably. Handling the Super Bear on the ground, I noticed that I had to rely on my zero forward visibility biplane training a lot more than I expected just from looking at the airplane from the outside. Though the accident pilot only mentioned not being familiar with the airplane as being a contributing factor, and I can't verify they had no experience with tail airplanes that lacked forward visibility, I would not be surprised if lack of such experience combined with the tall stance of the Super Bear helped to contribute to the ground loop. In any case, the moment I broke ground for the first time in the Super Bear, I was anticipating the worst, but my fears were quickly calmed. Despite its ragged and neglected exterior, the Super Bear flew like a dream. It was easily one of the best handling high-wing tailwheels I have ever flown, but it's hard to pinpoint exactly the reason why. It was highly stable, had light stick forces, and exceptionally well-coupled controls, all of which made it relatively easy to land, if one had experience with zero forward visibility tailwheels, that is. And it flew like a dream, without issue, all the way from PA to Texas, even with the left wingtip just duct taped together. Well, without issue, if you don't count the fact that on the last fuel stop, I discovered that the large can-style air filter had ovaled out its bolt holes on the attachment points and just completely fell off the airbox. Despite everything, I got the Super Bear delivered to the new owner, and the total cost of all the repairs and my charge to ferry it from PA to Texas was still less than it cost the owner to have 2 low-time pilots pick it up in New Hampshire and then ground loop it at my airport in Pennsylvania for, quote, free. Though getting the Super Bear delivered was the most unorthodox and risky ferry adventure I had attempted at the time, it gave me some great experience, and it was an awesome feeling saving it from being neglected on the ramp, damaged by another, quote, Ferry Pilot. In fact, a short while after I delivered the Super Bear, the new owner sent me photos of the restoration work he had done on it, and I could hardly believe that it was the same airplane. Anyways, that's the story of the sketchiest airplane I've ever flown. Thanks for sticking along for another ferry adventure. Hopefully, I'll have the time to make some more videos in the near future, but for now, I'll see ya.